English translation, 683rd contact Saturday, the 10th of June 2017, 22:01 hours.
Greetings, dear friend Eduard. Florena called me because you need my advice, but today I wanted to come here anyway because my last visit is also 3 weeks ago, and besides, I want to discuss some important things with you.
It is nice of you to come here so soon, Ptaah. It is just nice to have real friends you can rely on. But greetings and welcome to you too, of course, and I am also pleased that you are here now. Though I only asked Florena if she could follow up with you on the matter and then bring me your answer, for I did not want to rush you here.
You did not because, as I said, I was coming here today anyway I said that. But what is to be said about your question is that a mistake has crept in, but it is neither your fault nor Njana's fault because she corrected this contact conversation with you and Bernadette. The whole thing is not possible in any other way than that. On the one hand, the manipulation already took place in your computer after you called it up and after you wrote down the conversation, and that you then also printed out the whole thing so many times. But when you did your correction work, which Njana checked, everything was in order again, but when you finished the work, external manipulation took place again, in Bernadette's computer as well as in yours. Subsequently, the whole thing must be set right again, for which I give you the following correct wording of my father's conversation, which reads as follows.
These are the very biggest earthquakes, as well as various seaquakes, by which during all the time of the mentioned 15 years more than 480,000 human lives will be lost. Whereas, however, during the same period of time there will be several thousand other seaquakes and earthquakes worldwide, some of which will only cause...
Thanks, Ptaah. It is simply annoying that there is always this triple sparkle, which has been increasing again lately. The other day, Atlantis was standing next to the sofa in my office, when suddenly a small gold-colored fabric rose fell down on him, just from the ceiling, where nothing like that is. Look, this one is it.
The fabric rose that fell from the ceiling in Billy's office in 2 views. Note: similar fabric roses are known from religious folk art, for example from peasant devotional boxes, nativity scenes, Fachen children devotional picture in the form of an infant wrapped in ribbons, or monastery work.
Interesting. I have never seen anything like that in your workroom before, but quite obviously the sectarian influences and swinging waves are having an increased effect again. So I will inform Zafanat Paneach and Yanarara, so that they can make renewed efforts to deal with the swinging waves that are occurring again. The whole of these happenings must be very troublesome for you.
Yes, it is annoying, but it does not upset me. What is annoying, however, is when which I do not want to name openly and do not want to make a big fuss about because malicious people would again take this as an opportunity to accuse me. And this would probably be so, although I am the painted one, that is to say the one who suffers damage due to the new appearance.
I can understand your concerns, which is why I, too, think not to discuss the whole thing openly when you retrieve the conversation report and write it down.
I will, then something else. The other day there was a program on television concerning what we talked about some time ago, namely the actual origin of the emergence of the first cell-like life. You used the term Didaraun as the actual origin. In that program, I do not know what the title was, because I did not see the beginning of it. They also talked about an origin of the formation of cells or something, and they used the term formamide.
This television program was recorded by Njana, following which I am familiar with it, and I can also confirm that the term formamide used is identical to the term Didaraun that we use in our language for the whole thing.
Then a question. Can you give a rough recommendation for a future Figu center in southern Germany if one were to be established? My question relates to where it could be safest if, for example, the Eiffel caldera were to blow up, etc.
In southern Germany, the southeastern Swabian Bavarian area might be the most likely to be reasonably safe, though I must specifically say reasonably safe. The Eifel and its catchment areas in a wide radius will be extremely badly affected in the event of an eruption when the huge eruption takes place. The areas from southwest Germany to far into Alsace are also not recommended, because severe earthquakes will take place there, which will also spread into Switzerland via Basel, while the severe quakes will reach northwards to the Eifel caldera of Lake Lach, where the actual origin will be.
Thanks, that's what I wanted to know. But tell me, has anything changed recently with Florena and Enjana?
Why do you ask?
Just because something has come up that has raised a suspicion in me, but I do not want to blurt it out in a hurry.
Yes, a change has occurred because present and coming earthly world events require more persons to exercise Earth-wide control duties.
Aha! Although I was not thinking of your control duties, but rather a visit to Florena and Enjana.
No, it is not a visit, but 2 other persons who have volunteered for these control tasks.
Aha, and you do not have to try to make me curious because I think I know which person the one is. Taljda. Is it true or not?
Yes, but how do you know? Because to my knowledge, Taljda has not visited you yet.
Is it possible that Taljda and Florena were walking together at the center on the first weekend?
That is possible because the 2 of them had to carry out the control task regarding the General Assembly, and they probably also walked around the grounds during that time.
Whereby, of course, they could not be seen. Apparently, they also walked around in this way unnoticed near core group members, because Karen, the wife of Atlantis, noticed an intense scent of lemon from the hall across the house square, and then a scent of flowers behind the house by the platform or something.
That may be possible, if there is no deception. Because the 2 scents perceived by Karen point to Taljda and Florena, though I cannot say if it was really the 2, who actually scent each other with the 2 scent forms you mentioned.
Good term scenting, I must remember that. So I can look forward to a reunion with Taljda sometime in the near future. It has been so long.
Yes, you last saw each other on your 80th birthday.
Yes, it is also almost 6 months ago. How quickly time flies.
Taljda, Florena and Enjana will be visiting you in the next few days. But as always, these will be purely private visits, and as a result, as usual, there will be no reports of the conversations, so you do not have to retrieve them or write them down.
That is fine with me too, because what we, Florena and Enjana, talk about together is really private, so it will be the same with Taljda. But now I have a question. Actually, according to your statement some time ago regarding the earth and sea quakes in the Aegean, the time would have come again for it to shake. But so far there have been no earthquakes or sea quakes, which is supposed to continue the line. Also, some of your father Svatha's statements referred to the increasing dissolution of the permafrost, whereby whole villages are buried by falling mountain parts, as this has also actually happened in the last decades, although it has recently become quieter again in this respect. Moreover, the time has also come for terrorism to strike around the world and for assassinations, suicide bombings and assassination attempts to be carried out everywhere, for explosive attacks to cause destruction of all kinds, and for archaeologically valuable buildings to be blown up, as has already happened in Afghanistan by the Taliban and in Palmyra in Syria by the Islamist state that has criminalized humanity. And as the predictions of Svath have mentioned, from the year 2014 onwards is actually the great beginning of the career of terrorism, by which various states in the EU dictatorship will be affected, and especially England, which will be especially infested by lunatics and madmen, and also by lunatic individuals, who in partial derangement of consciousness or out of sheer hatred, will act in a murderous manner against those who think differently and believe differently. Even if, as always, it will probably not be of much use, or of any use at all, in terms of humanity finally waking up from its lethargy and beginning to think and act correctly. It would perhaps be important for some and others who are struggling to think and change, if once again some things are predicted for them. Since you now have the new prediction technology, this should be possible now. Or...
Of course it is possible, but as you yourself predict, it is extremely doubtful that it will be of any use because, as you yourself also say, it will probably not be of any use. But nevertheless, I want to reveal some things predictively for the next time. That which concerns the Aegean is correct, because at the beginning of next week, there will be another stronger quake in the Aegean. As for my father's other predictions, they have been fulfilled for years in various countries all over the world in terms of attacks and assassinations, with a lot of suffering and death being spread in Great Britain at the moment. But the other states of the European dictatorship will also not be spared. Nor will Pakistan, Iraq, and Mecca, as well as other places in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the world, because all terrorism is on the increase. Furthermore, as a result of criminally caused security failures, England will be affected by serious accidents and destruction in the near future, which will cause many deaths and shock the population. And what you mentioned regarding the destruction of historical buildings, this will continue to be done as it was done in Afghanistan and Palmyra, because by the Islamist State in the next few days in the Iraqi city of Mosul, a blast attack will be carried out on the old famous and virtually almost 850 years old Al-Nuri Mosque, and everything will be razed to the ground. Note, Njana, the 26th of June, 2017, during correction. The mosque was blown up by the Islamist State so that the Iraqi army could not bring down the black Islamist State flag. You know this mosque with its leaning minaret very well yourself. And you also know that it has been of great symbolic importance for the entire Islamist State until now. Because in 2014, the criminal Islamist State leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi proclaimed a caliphate for the areas controlled by the Islamist State in Syria and Iraq. In this episode, al-Baghdadi, whose correct name, however, is Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri, had the black Islamist State flag placed on the 45-meter-high minaret. And as for the landslides you mentioned, which have been happening all over the earth for decades, they will also continue, with the next one happening around the 23 RD/24th of June, mistakenly called a landslide, and causing more than 150 deaths. However, this mountain downfall will not be a rock slide, but a landslide, as such has occurred in the year 1806 in Switzerland at Goldau, by which I mean that it will indeed be a severe landslide. As in the case of Goldau, this has already been in the offing for some time, as a result of the thawing of the permafrost and long rains. But from a geological point of view, the emerging signs of the collapse of the mountain section have not been taken into account, and a catastrophe must and will inevitably occur. Contrary to a landslide, as the whole thing will be erroneously named, extensive masses of rock will break loose from their anchorage and tumble into the valley as large and small rock debris, splitting into boulders and large blocks and burying the entire village of Jinmo in southwest China's Sichuan province.
So it will not be a boulder slide as will be claimed, as you say, but an effective rock and boulder slide. As I learned in a special course as a civil engineer, normal debris belongs to rolling rock, because this is rounded and just rollable, whereby the rock moves downhill during transport by water, landslides, debris flows, or other ground movements, and their fracture edges become more or less rounded in the process. Rock debris consists of broken stones in different sizes. The size of this type of rock debris is mostly between 2 and 20 centimeters. Although if it is larger than 63 mm and up to the size of a house, it is called boulder debris, as will be the case if the landslide actually occurs and buries the village of Jinmo, as you say. However, I also learned that rock sediments start with a grain size above sand, while angular or broken rock sizes up to 63 mm are called gravel or quarry stones, after which the boulder scree is formed from 64 mm size onwards if it is rounded. However, if it is angular, then it is called block rubble. Block sizes are often delimited upwards, whereby the limits for the diameter are actually precise in the specialist sciences, but nevertheless not uniformly defined. Consequently, different dimensions can apply everywhere, and whereby the designation is often restricted to sediment that is reasonably rounded. Consequently, the whole thing is often understood even more vaguely. Thus, for example, terms circulate such as 1. Clay, silt, sand, coarser boulder rubble, rounded 2, not rounded, often artificially created, rubble 3, consolidated, conglomerate 4, depending on the shape. Pieces from 64 mm, 200 mm, and house-sized and more are considered as blocks 5, stones, coarse rubble, boulders. Coarse stones and rubble up to 63 mm 6. Block rubble from 64 mm up to 200 mm and house-sized etc. 7. Coarse gravel, center stones rounded, 20 mm, 63 mm 8. Gravel crushed rock, 20 mm, approx. 65 mm 9. Medium gravel, fine stones, crushed stone, 6.3 mm 20 mm 10. Large crushed chippings partly from approx. 8. 14 mm 11. Fine gravel, crushed stone rounded, 2 mm 6.3 mm 12. Road gravel crushed chippings with sand, approx. 5 mm 14 18ths mm 13. Demolition debris various sizes from small to large. Now, as far as these size specifications are concerned, these are the ones I have learned. And as for the horrors that will shake human beings in the near future, they do not diminish but increase. And as far as the story of the Goldau landslide is concerned, I learned a few things at school, as I also learned from your father Svath. Therefore, I know the following. This event took place, as you mentioned, in 1806. This catastrophic landslide had already announced itself about 30 years earlier through characteristic signs such as increasing cracking on the mountain, stone rolling and loud cracking of blasted rocks and roots. Especially in the winters, the waters in the filled open crevices had frozen into ice and blasted the rocks, causing thundering noises, but nothing was done about it from a geological point of view, and the population was not evacuated. Although everyone actually expected the Rossberg to fall one day, only 5 human beings drew the consequences and left the danger area. In 1799, 1804, and 1805, there were periods of particularly high rainfall, exactly like in Jinmo, and on the 2nd of September 1806, the catastrophe finally occurred. For Switzerland, it was the largest natural disaster to occur in historical times after the Basel earthquake of 1356, which, as I remember Svath explaining, was to be calculated with a magnitude of 7.1 on the Richter scale, and occurred on the 18th of October 1356, whereby the epicenter was near Rheinach-Baselland. That is to say, only a few kilometers south of today's border triangle of Germany, France, and Switzerland. On the southern flank of the Rossberg in the canton of Schwyz, precisely on Goldau's local mountain. As I learned from Svath and at school, around 40 million cubic meters of Nagelfluh rock started to move from the Gniepenspitze and plunged about 1,000 meters down into the valley on a sliding track inclined at about 20 degrees downhill over heavily soaked intermediate clay layers. The landslide spread rapidly and broadly in a fan shape towards the bottom and rolled through the valley, with the mass of the landslide burning up the opposite Rigi chain to a height of 100 meters. The entire landslide buried an area of around 6.5 square kilometers and destroyed the villages of Goldau and Rotten, as well as parts of Bösingen and Lauers. And this landslide catastrophe claimed 457 human lives, with over 100 houses, 220 barns and stables, as well as 2 churches and 2 chapels also completely destroyed. The villages of Goldau and Rothen disappeared and were buried under masses of fallen rock without any hope of rescue. Even today, boulders the size of houses still bear witness to the catastrophe. Lake Lauers was also affected, for the masses of rock that fell into it, triggering a 20-meter-high tidal wave, reduced it by 1/7 of its surface area. A commemorative plaque was later erected at Goldau railway station, and the landslide itself was subsequently used as an opportunity to get the first Swiss fundraising campaign off the ground, thereby also strengthening national solidarity. For many religious believers, the landslide was, as usual with natural disasters, a demonstration of divine might. But the catastrophe also led to the first scientific investigation of such an event, which was then also explained in detail. The Rossberg was a rockfall area which, as your father Schwath explained, was very fissured in itself, with water accumulating in the cracks and freezing in the cold winters to blast the rocks in this way. This rock, consisting of banks of nagelfluh, then began to slide due to the blasting effect and the damp, weathered marl subsoil underneath, on which the enormous weight of the rock masses that had been blasted loose could no longer adhere. The trigger for the landslide was therefore on the one hand the constant heavy rainfall, the blasting of the rock masses by the frozen crack ice, and finally by the slippery marl subsoil. The village of Goldau, belonging to the political municipality of Arth, Canton Schwyz, was rebuilt on the landslide debris cone and grew into an important traffic hub. In addition, a nature and animal park was created amidst huge boulders in the landslide area of Goldau, which has become a popular destination for excursions. Furthermore, a hiking trail leads through pioneer vegetation on the Rossberg-Kneipen into the landslide area, where there is a plant conservation area in a clearing, which is looked after by members of the Pro-Rossberg Foundation, and where numerous orchid species have an occurrence, and specifically the yellow lady's slipper.
As always, I must say that you are good at remembering the importance of occurrences and also when they are only told to you verbally.
Thanks, but unfortunately, that is not the case with all human beings. Because again and again I have to notice that with many human beings the memories are often quite badly deficient, and what is experienced, said or heard is presented differently than it corresponded to reality. Especially when something has been said by oneself or said to someone. Then it is later vehemently denied, and everything is portrayed differently, up to the point of malicious assertion, than everything was said in reality.
That this is indeed the case is undeniable. For the majority of all human beings are not capable of registering perceptions in such a precise and exact manner that no error memories occur. In fact, in the majority of human beings, self-deception occurs with regard to memories of what is experienced, observed, said, heard, and perceived, and this extends to unwanted self-deception and unconscious lying. This very often leads to differences and even to quarrels among human beings. When one side demonstrably knows the facts correctly and can correct them, while the other side has reality in memory, not in a truthful way, but from its unclear view and reproduces it according to its own and false memory repetition, claiming, of course, to be in the right with its memory.
I realize that, and I experience that all the time. But back to the other thing we were talking about. So everything goes on with all the evil in the world. But to say something to the Earthlings and to warn them is, after all, pointless, as it is in every relationship. Because it is not listened to, not even to the fact that the humanity of Earth is living in very frightening times, in which autocrats and populists are doing their political mischief and triumphing. This is because the majority of peoples are stupid enough to take the drivel and bullshit presented to them, as well as the empty promises and paintings of salvation at face value and to wallow in them gullibly. The facts, however, the reality and its truth, are not perceived, not recognized and not understood, so also not that more and more human beings flee their homeland because their lives are threatened or simply flee to foreign countries because they see no future and no better life for themselves in their homeland. At present, there are 72 million refugees, as you mentioned recently. In many cases, however, these refugees also include work-shy and criminal elements, as well as terrorists who cause damage or mischief in the countries of refuge. In the shadow of the political upheavals and unrest, the world and humanity are heading for ecological collapse, while every year tens of thousands of living beings of all species and kinds die out in nature because they are wiped out by the criminal machinations of overpopulation. Consequently, the diversity of life in fauna and flora rapidly decreases, whereby humanity will also begin to suffer sooner or later on a vicious scale. Through the fault of Earth humans or as a result of the criminal machinations of overpopulation, which are causing irreparable catastrophes in nature and its fauna and flora. The worst mass extinction of earthly life forms has already been occurring for some time, as has not happened since time immemorial. All the extinction of the many thousands of life forms per year is a direct result of the environmental destruction caused by the irresponsible and life-destroying machinations of overpopulation. And this also includes climate change, with CO2 levels in the atmosphere currently higher than they have been for millennia.
Unfortunately, all your words do not bring about any change in the understanding of the majority of Earth humans. Consequently, everything will continue in the old and destructive framework.
That is also clear to me. So then something else again. Donald Trump would have been a good U.S. president, at least in this matter, if he had kept his election promise that the USA would no longer interfere in the affairs of foreign states. But he continues in this respect in the same framework as all his predecessors. Consequently, the whole of his election promise was just empty talk, because just like all his predecessors, he travels around the world and on the one hand mixes arms deals, on which the U.S. economy is supposed to be healthy, and on the other hand he interferes with his politics and also militarily in the affairs of foreign states. And now it has come to the point that he is being accused of lying under oath by the FBI boss he fired, James Comey. I have compiled his 6 most explosive statements here, although I think that the accusations are more an act of revenge than the truth, because Trump is probably not so stupid and dumb that he would get himself into trouble the way Comey is making him do.
Quotes from Wikipedia. These are the 6 most explosive statements from the hearing with ex-FBI chief James Comey. Trump is a liar. The president wanted an end to the investigation into Michael Flynn. His firing was because of the Russia investigation. James Comey's testimony before the Senate had Tinder. These findings will make headlines for the next few days. Trump's lawyer accuses Comey of lying. The president himself remains silent. For Comey, Trump is a liar. The contradictory statements about the reason for his firings are proof for Comey that President Trump lied. Trump's statements about the allegedly bad state of the FBI were also lies. Those were lies, plain and simple, Comey says, of the administration's description of an FBI in disarray under him. A lie, according to James Comey, is also Trump's public statement that he never asked Comey about the investigation into the resigned National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. Comey felt pressured by Trump. In the particularly explosive conversation between Donald Trump and James Comey in the Oval Office, on the 14th of February this year, Trump stepped onto legally thin ice. He indicated to Comey with the following wording that he would like to see an end to the investigation of his National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, who had resigned shortly before. I hope you see a clear path to let go of Flynn. He is a good guy. I hope you can let this go. Comey, I took it as direction. I did not obey that, but that is the way I took it. The ex-FBI chief also found the fact that Trump demanded a one-on-one meeting with Comey after a meeting with high-ranking members of the government and heads of other security agencies highly problematic. Trump interfered inappropriately, but did not give Comey any orders. Did Trump obstruct justice? The former FBI boss found Trump's desire for personal loyalty, his wish for the FBI to make the dark cloud of the Russia investigation disappear, and his expressed hope for an end to the Flynn investigation to be inappropriate interference in the FBI's work. When asked by Republican senators, however, Comey specified that Trump had not asked him in unequivocal terms to drop the investigation. For Comey, however, it is clear that the special investigator Robert Mueller must also investigate whether Trump had engaged in obstruction of justice. In 1973, U.S. President Richard Nixon, who had to resign because of the Watergate affair, stumbled over this accusation. Comey says Trump did not direct him to drop investigation into Flynn using those words. Comey's dismissal was a reaction to the Russia investigation. What role did Russia play in the U.S. election campaign? Ultimately, the whole affair revolves around this question. Several senators asked Comey what he thought was the reason for his dismissal. He repeated under oath that the reason for his dismissal was the Russia investigation. Trump had initially denied this accusation, fueling the question of whether Trump was trying to obstruct the investigation with Comey's dismissal. Comey passed on memos of conversations to the media. After his dismissal, Comey passed on interview notes to the New York Times via a friend. In response to questions from Republican senators on the committee, James Comey has admitted that he himself was behind the revelation of the recording of his conversation between himself and Trump about the investigation into Michael Flynn. After his dismissal, he had asked a friend to pass on his memo to a journalist. As a private citizen, he felt that the public should have this information. Comey admits that after his dismissal, he asked a friend to share the contents of his memo with a reporter. Comey wanted a special investigator to be appointed in the Russia affair. The New York Times reported on this memo on the 17th of May. Comey had noted in it that Trump had asked him to drop the investigation against former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. No doubt about Russian hacking, no evidence of election meddling. The threat to American democracy from Russian influence is a bipartisan problem that affects Democrats and Republicans alike, he said. They're coming after America. Since the end of 2015, more than 100 incidents of attempted influence by Russian authors on the election campaign have been reported to him. The clear intention behind this is to influence the outcome of the election in Russia's favor. However, there are no indications that the election results were manipulated.
This man, James Comey, acted and is acting for purely selfish, deceitful, hostile and spiteful reasons to take unforgiving and hateful revenge on U.S. President Donald Trump for his dismissal as FBI chief. On the one hand, lying and slandering, and on the other hand, perjuring himself. But this will not be the only thing against Donald Trump, because there will be a real slanderous hunt against him to make him politically and in office impossible.
Look here. What do you think about what I wrote here in my new book? Can it be said that way?
So that was the good for nothing. While the second evil soon followed, in the form of the confused German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who self-importantly, stupidly and brazenly proclaimed the refugee being welcome culture. As a result, on the one hand, well over 1 million refugees from African, Arab, Near Eastern and various other countries streamed into Europe, together with antisocials, criminals, work-shy people and terrorists, who committed and continue to commit bloody acts of terrorism in various European countries, which have claimed and will continue to claim many innocent human lives. On the other hand, since Merkel's culture of welcoming refugees and the resulting refugee flows became known, thousands of refugees have lost their lives on their escape routes, often in horrific ways, for which the conscienceless and high-handed German Chancellor Merkel is entirely responsible, but for which she has not yet been held accountable and probably never will be. And this despite the fact that the whole fomented refugee disaster is the equivalent of provoked mass murder in terms of the thousands of deaths. And this will be so despite the fact that its whole refugee machination in this regard amounts not only to a farce, but to a crime against humanity, because it has unconscionably steered refugees, women, men and children of all ages, from war zones and from underdeveloped states on death marches, on which many thousands have had to fight for their lives, but lost that fight and died miserably.
Of course, this is correct, because the whole thing is tantamount to mass murder, for which this confused and at the same time high-handed Mrs. Angela Merkel has to bear the responsibility and would have to be held accountable for it. Which, however, as you say, will probably not happen, because on Earth such state officials wrongly enjoy immunity, which, however, contradicts any legal and humane order and justice. What has been done by this woman corresponds to a provoked mass murder of several thousand times, which would have to be punished with a banishment for life or with a prison sentence for effective life, because according to fallible earthly laws, a banishment is no longer applied.
For effective murder or mass murder, a life sentence in most countries on Earth does not mean life, but only 25 years. Whereby the sentence can be greatly reduced in the case of so-called good conduct during the sentence. In the US, at least, life imprisonment actually means life.
For an act of murder carried out by a human being in a deliberate manner, as well as for an instruction to commit murder, a life sentence would also have to be given by law through banishment or locking away in a penal institution, etc. This, as it would also have to be the case if human beings were driven to their deaths by any circumstances, such as the refugee welcome culture, which corresponds to a refugee terrorism proclaimed by the pathologically smug Angela Merkel, as a result of which thousands of refugees from various countries have lost their lives, children, young people, and adults. What the woman has done with this corresponds to nothing more and nothing less than mass murder, for which Merkel should be held accountable. But who does not have an evil conscience about her refugee murder culture? Because her intellect, her reason, and her perception of responsibility in her stupidity and self-importance and obsession with power do not reach so far that she could recognize her guilt. Merkel's welcoming culture is not a human being-friendly culture, but something utterly terroristically despicable and a crime against humanity, even if the confused chancellor has in the meantime turned away from her refugee-welcoming mania. Furthermore, it must be said that a human life at all, as the highest conscious life, is the most valuable in this respect and must be protected because it can never be replaced if it dies or is killed and murdered by any circumstances.
Your execution is also in line with my view. But what do you think about what I am dealing with in my new book, which I have put down as various articles Florena has photographed and sent to you for evaluation? Did you even have time to read them?
I took the time to read them, of course.
Then I can insert them here during our conversation, I guess, if you do not mind.
Of course.
That is fine with me. I will add the articles then.
As a concept of global overpopulation, this has nothing to do with the overpopulation of a specific area, because overpopulation must be understood as the worldwide excess of human beings, whereby the number of human beings on Earth exceeds the ecological carrying capacity of the entire earthly habitat. In the past, population policy arguments were regularly subject to change, with the issue of overpopulation being established at the international level by the First World Population Conference in Geneva in 1927. The entire theme of that conference dealt with the thematic relationship between human population and its size, relative to the human living space on planet Earth. The term theme is also used in the social sciences, where it also describes demography and population geography. With regard to the overpopulation of earthly human beings and their living space on Earth, different definitions exist, whereby in a spatial context one speaks of global, regional, and local overpopulation, whereby, however, one can correctly only speak of overpopulation in a global manner, whereas with regard to a local and regional large number of human beings, one can only speak of overpopulation. With regard to a global qualitative dimension concerning the mass of human beings, there can be no different opinions and assessment criteria because how high the carrying capacity of certain habitats or the entire Earth is for human beings depends on nature, its fauna and flora, the oceans and inland waters as well as the climate, and also on the fertile land masses that can cover the cultivation of food and the food requirements of human beings.
Thus, in terms of reason and rationality, there can be no difference of opinion with regard to global overpopulation, but there can be with regard to the fact that in certain areas or in precisely determinable regions, there are apodictic overpopulations and population sizes, which however are in any case related to global overpopulation. Global overpopulation is not a broad definition, but it is a given worldwide condition because the world's population is in reality no longer able to live sustainably with the lifestyle of overpopulation size desired in today's world. For decades now, a narrow definition has existed that fulfills the condition of overpopulation in the relationship that food, water, or energy shortages have occurred in various states and threaten the immediate ability of the populations concerned to survive in part or as a whole. And if we consider that almost 1 billion human beings in the world are starving and many are dying of hunger, then this corresponds to a problem that should actually stimulate the conscience of all earthly human beings, in such a way that each individual human being should recognize his or her responsibility and be anxious to voluntarily submit to a birth stop and birth control. Global overpopulation must not only be assumed to be one of the central problems of mankind, for it is indisputably the greatest and absolute human problem of all. For many decades of the last 2 centuries, it has led to enormous problems such as poverty, hunger, unemployment, as well as to the growth of slums, to enmities among human beings, but also to hatred, murder, manslaughter, and wars. And these inhumane factors do not occur today mainly only in developing countries, where there is a population explosion and immense population pressure. If we look at the whole picture, it becomes unmistakably clear that all these evils also exist in the civilized world and in the so-called industrialized and welfare states, where unemployment and poverty prevail on a large scale, as do racial hatred, murder and manslaughter, enmities of all kinds, moral depravity, terrorism, crime, and all kinds of other evils and inhumanities. Particularly worthy of mention are also the environmental problems and the global ecological evil footprint of mankind on Earth, which in areas such as land consumption, oil consumption, overfishing, deforestation, water consumption, or pollutant emissions, is already too high in many cases and in connection with the growth of the world's population. With regard to individual countries, areas and regions, it is indisputable that overpopulation must be spoken of even if fewer human beings live there, and even if it is only overpopulation that must be measured on the basis of certain place criteria, such as population density, the degree of self-sufficiency, land consumption, environmental damage, or quality of life. Global overpopulation has also brought and continues to bring about worldwide deforestation, with worldwide conversions of forest land to land uses for food and minerals, such as explosive engine fuels, taking place as a result of the excessive mass of humanity. According to the calculations of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, forest loss is caused, among other things, by poverty and strong population growth in the affected regions. And this destruction of forest areas is often caused by so-called land grabbing, that is to say by international investors who clear large areas of forest for plantations, also huge areas of rainforest, destroying the livelihoods of forest animals and other forest creatures, even human beings or indigenous peoples, and thus wiping out many life forms. In many poor African, South American, and Asian, as well as micro, poly, and Indonesian areas and countries, the forest cover has declined tremendously in a criminal manner over the last decades. The human beings there are for the most part farmers who work in a subsistence economy, or a demand economy, which corresponds to a basic economic strategy in which production primarily serves self-sufficiency without significant surpluses. In contrast to pure self-sufficiency, however, it also includes the bartering of one's own products on local markets. Due to the strong population growth, however, it was and is not possible for them to feed their families from the available arable land, which has led and will continue to lead to deforestation. However, the forest protected the land from soil erosion, which in the long term will result in a much greater loss of arable land. The loss of forests has a significant impact on the lives of human beings in all countries worldwide, And not only in poor countries, because the forest protects against soil erosion, floods, and avalanches everywhere in the world. In addition, the forest still provides wood for necessary furniture and all kinds of other things in many places in the third millennium, as it is also the most important source of heating material in various countries and regions, and is also used for cooking in many third world countries. With regard to the availability of water, we must speak of the available freshwater resources, whereby this refers to the amount of fresh water that is available to a single human being per year. Depending on the size of this quantity, the subordinate terms water scarcity, water shortage, and water emergency, up to and including water crisis, must be defined. Water shortage has been one of the central problems for decades, and in the third millennium it will become more and more precarious as a result of the inexorable increase in overpopulation, as well as the destruction of the environment in terms of forests, fields, meadows, alluvial areas, meadows, oceans, inland waters, and atmospheric and climatic degradation. In the future, all this will affect all earthly existence of every kind much more, so also the life of mankind, which will be affected by all that it itself is destroying recklessly and thoughtlessly through the machinations of overpopulation, and is working towards slowly but surely wiping itself out. The increasing population growth alone, which is getting bigger and bigger and includes an increase of over 100 million per year, is causing the number of deaths caused by water shortage alone to rise very sharply, with also more and more armed conflicts over water, so-called water fights, arising and causing many deaths. Since the concept of overpopulation exists both conceptually and in terms of content, that there are just globally far too many human beings is judged by pathologically stupid, intelligent, unteachable, self-important, and egoistic people to be contemptuous of human beings, whereby they claim that laws from biology are inadmissibly transferred to the human social sphere. So the pathologically stupid and know-it-alls doubt that the Earth's carrying capacity is already exhausted because in their stupidity they rather see everything solely in social, economic, and ecological problems, which they attribute solely to political and governmental failures, through which a poor distribution of the, allegedly, altogether sufficient resources comes about. It is true that political and governmental failures are very much to blame for many disasters that have affected and will continue to affect earthly humanity, but not in the way that the stupid and impudent accusations of the unintelligent claim. Nevertheless, the responsible politicians and rulers must be blamed for the rampant overpopulation, because in their self-importance, which also included stupidity and cowardice, the responsible politicians and rulers worldwide have not been able to teach the peoples that overpopulation means the downfall of humanity and the destruction of the planet as well as its fauna and flora, and that consequently a regulated birth stop and a following birth regulation must be introduced. The stupidity here is based on the laziness and indifference of not wanting to perceive the effective facts, which consist in the fact that through the destructive machinations caused by overpopulation on the planet, its nature and fauna and flora, the whole disaster of destruction is becoming more and more vicious and worse. This, then, while on the other hand, the cowardice of politicians and rulers is founded in the fact that they are afraid of losing their offices and their might. Therefore, all the destruction of the planet, of nature and its fauna and flora can continue. The environmental pollution alone and the destruction caused to nature and its fauna and flora by the thoughtless and irresponsible machinations of global overpopulation are extremely catastrophic and not only life-threatening, but have even been deadly for all earthly life forms for some time, so also for the human beings of Earth. At present, the world's population is increasing by more than 100 million human beings per year, that is to say, by more than 1 billion within 10 years. And this is the case despite the fact that in some industrialized countries declining birth rates are becoming apparent, but this is of no consequence because, in short, the number of births is increasing again. In fact, it is not the case, as statistics and know-it-all organizations claim that in most countries of the world the increase has been almost unchanged for 15 years, because effectively this is nothing more than a whitewash lie. In reality, the population policy of governments, insofar as it aims at reducing the birth rate at all, is completely inadequate, as is also the case with the work of non-governmental organizations that only provide women with access to sexual education and contraceptives. The fact that men must also be involved in the whole area is completely forgotten, since relatively high numbers of children are not only born in sub-Saharan Africa, but very often all over the world due to the unreasonableness of men, even when women are against having children or in favor of having fewer children. But the men do not have to give birth, so many do not care what a birth means for a woman, because the only thing that is important to the men is that they can produce one or more offspring, while female offspring are frowned upon, often mistreated and sexually abused or simply killed, as is still the case in some places today, which used to be the case in Arabia too, before the herald Muhammad came and forbade this crime. Nowadays, although many more women have access to contraceptives than in the past, every third or fourth woman is still unable to use modern methods of contraception due to poverty or oppression by men. According to Player and Data, more than 360 million women in developing countries do not have access to family planning and consequently also to contraceptives, while countless other women do not use contraceptives or are not allowed to use them due to men's prohibitions of violence. In the industrialized countries, where a population decline occurs from time to time, sometimes it is only to be expected. State premiums for offspring are paid out as a negative consequence, which of course does not lead to fewer births, but to more births again. There is the delusion that more births must take place so that more young human beings work and pay into pension funds so that pensioners can receive their pensions. There are also complaints that due to the aging of the human beings, more births would have to take place because more old people's homes etc. would have to be built, which would have to be paid for by the descendants. And due to the fact that certain irresponsible organizations are lying about the fact that the birth rates in many countries worldwide have decreased considerably in the last decades, some scientists are already talking about an empty cradle, and fear that an underpopulation in the industrialized countries could lead to a loss of prosperity. This while others, more truthful, continue to warn of the consequences of overpopulation, which continues to grow inexorably. While the fantasy data of the Earth's population calculation agencies on the 7th of June 2017 at 14:00 hours assumed 7,422,296,189 human beings according to the live world population display clock. The Earth's population, according to very precise Player data on the 31st of December 2016, at 0:00 hours already counted 8,739,001,024 or 8.739 billion Earth humans. On the 13th of May 1968 in Tehran, Iran, the International Conference on Human Rights included in its proclamation a passage stating that every married couple should be granted the fundamental right to decide freely on the number of children and the intervals between births, which was reaffirmed in the action programs of the World Population Conferences of 1974 in Bucharest, 1984 in Mexico City, and 1994 in Cairo. Not once was it mentioned that the unstoppable increase in overpopulation and its destructive machinations are causing an ever greater and greater disaster worldwide in terms of the planet, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as in terms of the poisoning of human beings. And this poisoning is caused by pesticides that are applied to vegetable gardens, vines, fruit trees, etc., that settle in food and drinking water, and that also cause cancer and many other diseases and illnesses. In order to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, the right to family planning was made binding for women for the first time in 1979, in a convention or in the so-called Women's Convention, which was, of course, completely correct, but which completely omitted to refer to a restriction of offspring in order to counteract the rampant overpopulation. Whether the responsible politicians and rulers as well as the entire Earth humans finally succeed in exercising their intellect and reason in order to curb population growth in the poor and poorer developing countries as well as in the rich states also depends on the intelligence and decisions of the politicians, rulers and the entire Earth humans. Central to this is also the implementation of the resolutions of the Cairo World Population Conference of 1994, whereby the core points of the whole also include a qualitative and quantitative improvement of reproductive health care, including healthy and birth-regulating family planning, as well as the empowerment of women, that is to say, the strengthening of their legal, economic and social position, their self-determination, equality and equal rights in all things, including with regard to pay and all rights in general. It is also urgently necessary to strengthen the role of women in every respect, and to be mindful of the fact that women are not simply there to have children. Basically, they need to be properly educated about birth control and consequently also be able to decide for themselves about their sexuality and contraception, and whether or not they want to bring offspring into the world at all, without any violent interference from a man. Worldwide, a UN World Population Conference has been held every 10 years since 1974, at which fundamental problems and accumulating results are discussed worldwide. Various concepts for controlling reproductive behavior have been developed and implemented at regional and local level in different regions, partly within the framework of development aid, but to date neither a birth stop nor birth regulation have been discussed. Although family planning is to be promoted through education campaigns and the provision of contraceptives, there is never any mention of the necessary education that rampant overpopulation is increasingly degenerating into a world catastrophe, as a result of which a worldwide birth stop and birth control must be introduced. Poor, work-shy, and welfare-dependent persons, as well as criminal and delinquent persons, were given the right to marry in various countries in the 19th century. In the 19th century, marriage restrictions were imposed in various countries in order to reduce population growth at that time, because people were already thinking much more rationally and assessing what they observed, including the fact that there was already overpopulation at that time, which caused various problems, even though, according to Ptaah and data, the total world population in the 19th century, that is to say from 1801 to 1900, was only 1,660,990,034 human beings. In addition to marriage restrictions, emigration, especially to America, was also considered and encouraged in European countries as a means of combating the growing overpopulation, in that the authorities sometimes paid for the passage of destitute people and/or also urged human beings to leave the country, such as work-shy people, criminal elements, all kinds of sect members, vagrants, and hobos. Hatterlump = also Hattersack, Lumpensack, Lumpsack, Lumpenpack. Lump was and is a common swear word, especially in southern Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Silesia, for a have-not or good-for-nothing, especially if he came or comes in torn clothes. Furthermore, in various countries, attempts were made to relieve very densely populated and/or resource-poor areas and regions by resettling them in more resource-rich and sparsely populated areas if they were hard-working and righteous human beings who could also manage well. The transmigrasi policy in Indonesia can be taken as an example in this regard, which promotes the settlement of human beings from the island of Java to other islands with benefits. Indonesia is one of the most densely populated countries on Earth, but its population is very unevenly distributed, with the island of Java being one of the most densely populated and agriculturally intensive areas on Earth. In contrast, other parts of Indonesia are extremely sparsely populated, such as the islands of Kalimantan or Sumatra. For this reason, there were projects years ago to resettle the population from the island of Java to other islands according to plan. Within the framework of the Transmigrasi project, trans =across, migrare =to migrate, almost 1 million families corresponding to a total of around 3.7 million human beings were resettled between 1952 and 1989. In Ethiopia, too, farmers were forcibly resettled in the 1980s, mainly from the drought and erosion-stricken highlands to lowland regions with higher precipitation, although this forced behavior has changed in the meantime, as a result of which the Ethiopian government now runs a voluntary resettlement program. At the present time, earthly humanity is experiencing completely degenerated turmoil, which is giving it a very hard time because the majority of human beings, as has been the case since time immemorial, do not listen to prophecies and predictions, Consequently, they do not change for the better, the good, the positive, and the correct. The majority of humanity is becoming more and more indifferent, selfish and unrelated to each other, while also falling more and more into affective stupidity and participating less and less in real life, because they have completely lost the sense and understanding of the correct way of life, attitude to life, conduct of life, and correct conduct of life through a boredom of life. And the fact in this regard is that the bulk of the entire earthly population has converted to a new faith. The bulk of humanity has devoted itself to this new faith with skin and hair, and has completely internalized its guiding principles. And this opium of humanity has taken such deep root in the consciousness of the human beings afflicted by it, that a completely new, pathological, stupid, senseless, worthless, and thoughtless thinking has taken possession of the human beings afflicted by it. What has spread worldwide in this respect, and taken possession of the thoughtlessness of the human beings of the earth, as an evil that continues to take hold, is today called electronic communication, although this communication neither corresponds to such nor has any real value. Effectively, the truth is that the majority of humanity, which senselessly fritters away its daily routine and life with this communication technology, has become completely indifferent in every respect, and therefore also knows no interpersonal relationships, let alone an effectively true meaning of life and responsibility for life. And since this is so, the great mass of humanity lets the superiors, and above all those politically unfit politicians, think, do, and rule for themselves, who only satisfy their might and their lust for power, as well as their financial profit and their personal well-being, but not the well-being and not the advantage of the people. And in exactly the same framework are the religious and sectarian monarchs of faith, who think for their stupid believers, and slobber over them with stupid blind show miracles of alleged divine majesty, love, help and security, and promise divine salvation. And the fact that their believers do not smell a rat, let themselves be fooled and pay the storytellers horrendously for it, can only work because the believers themselves are not capable of thinking, or are too lazy to do so. And since this is the case, the believers also allow their religious and sectarian storytellers to be paid horrendously by the state. When the states in question pay their religious and sectarian leaders as well as their churches, temples, synagogues, mosques, and other divine humble huts and soul-launching pads through outrageous religious and sectarian taxes, which are mercilessly and viciously imposed without pardon, even on those citizens who belong to neither a religion nor a sect. In this respect, the fact is that these rotten state machinations are also of a false political nature. That is to say, of a state, religious, legal, and military nature, because all these forms are interrelated and used among themselves to dominate the people. And whoever denies this is lying through his or her teeth, because all four forms of politics play into each other, so the state and the religions and sects in one, because the state, precisely in those countries where this is the case, collects religious or sectarian taxes for the religions and sects from the citizens, in order to keep the souls in the state. The state, in those countries where this is the case, collects religious or sectarian taxes from the citizenry to pay the soul-selling religious representatives, as well as to maintain their churches, temples, synagogues, mosques, and other divine humble huts and soul-launching pads. With regard to law, it is the case that, at least in those states where this is legally regulated in this way or another, all citizens must pay religious and sectarian taxes of one kind or another, even if they are atheists, unbelievers, or otherwise do not want to know anything about religions and sects, and are therefore free thinkers, etc. With regard to military politics, there is the fact that in every army in the world, there are religious fairy tale tellers involved who, with their religious sectarian attributes, on the one hand look after the military with faith fairy tales, and lead them astray so that they create hatred in themselves against the alleged enemy, and courageously go into battle. Connected with this is the fact that through these religious rascals, the courage of the soldiers for the fight and also the will to kill should be increased in order to shoot, stab and massacre their fellow human beings for the sake of peace, but also to cause enormous destruction to human achievements. And for all this to happen, the troops and their weapons are blessed by the so-called clergy in the name of a non-existent and therefore imaginary God, and the fighters are recommended to the protection of some god who promises the faithful. With this, the soldiers then go to war and cause massacres and destruction that mock all love, all human rights, all peace and all humanity, as well as all responsibility for life. In addition to all this, assassins and terrorists, murderers and mass murderers, as well as warmongers, warlords and other madmen in governments, dictatorships, republics and other spheres of power spread bloody intimidation, tyranny, horror, servitude, pogroms, or riots against national, religious, or ethnic minorities, as well as oppression, horror, fear, terror, and terror. But warlords or military actors who have taken control of a limited area that has slipped out of the hands of the state, especially in states weakened or failed by civil war, also carry out their murderous mischief. The idea of peace among human beings is already very old, but it could never be realized in the course of earthly human history up to the present day, because there were always powerful people who, in their lust for power, expressed their lust for power over and over again and instigated and carried out murderous wars, which through the stupidity and obedience of human beings to their authorities, caused millions and millions of deaths and immense destruction to the detriment of all peoples involved in such wars. And this in addition to the fact that the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as far more than 2,000 monstrous nuclear weapons tests, also provoked much destruction of fauna and flora worldwide. The fact is that since the invention and dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as through further nuclear research and nuclear tests, the majority of the earthly population has turned more and more towards evil, negative and bad, and today stands at a point where it will soon only be a case of bird eat or die. Because everything destructive brought about by humanity is becoming more and more unstoppable, which soon can no longer be countered, and the whole thing can no longer be stopped. The world of Earth humans is already so destroyed with regard to the oceans, inland waters, floodplains, meadows, forests, and landscapes that many small species of animals and creatures, as well as various species of birds and creepy crawlies, etc., have been irrevocably wiped out. Contributing to this is above all, in addition to the rapidly developing technology on which the majority of Earth humans have become completely and rapidly dependent, the blatant and inexorably growing overpopulation, through whose machinations and effects nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the planet itself, are slowly but surely becoming unlivable and destroyed. Earth humans are slowly but surely creating their own demise, because it is to be assumed that they will continue in the same destructive style as before. Thus, earthly humanity will become a loser, just as all criminals, antisocial elements, all work-shy people, criminals, misanthropes, and terrorists are cowardly, characterless, and nameless losers and failures. The order of the day and of the future would now be to put an end to all the madness of Earth humans with regard to the ever faster growing overpopulation and all the resulting criminal destruction of climate change, which has already begun and will lead to catastrophic consequences in a few decades. But the predictions make it clear that all the destruction, devastation, chaos, and catastrophes will not be stopped. So all the bad things set out by the predictions cannot be avoided. But that does not stop me from continuing to call out that all the overpopulation madness and its destructive machinations must be stopped, and stopped very quickly, before nothing can be saved. This, however, requires that a worldwide and controlled birth stop be introduced, followed by an effective birth control which will reduce the world population and keep it at a reasonable level. This alone can curb the increasing needs and desires of earthly humanity, and end all the destruction that goes with it and reduce it to a reasonable level. In fact, a great deal of evil has already been done in 2017 for the predictions to be relentlessly fulfilled. And also in the respect that environmental pollution from fossil fuel engines of all kinds, as well as from smokestacks, etc., has become a problem. This is in addition to innumerable other forms of water, air, and general environmental pollution, as well as the destruction of cultivated land by more and more human buildings of all kinds, such as houses, factories, roads and paths, sports grounds, etc.
Now what do you think about this, though? Should I elaborate on these various facts?
I suppose it is not necessary, for I think it is detailed enough. But now, dear friend, I have some things to discuss with you which must be off the record.